Welcome to Revenge with Luna. From now on, you handle your own expenses. Your phone bill, your gym membership, your little online shopping habit, none of that is my problem anymore. I'm not your ATM, Clara. My husband said this at the dinner table. Not in private, not in a whispered argument behind a closed bedroom door the way most couples fight. He said it in front of our friends Jess and her boyfriend, Ryan, who had come over for what was supposed to be a casual Friday dinner. The pasta was still warm. The wine hadn't even been opened yet. He said it with his fork halfway to his mouth, like it was a budget update and not a declaration of war. I looked at him across the table, at the way he held his fork like a gavel, at the slight smirk he didn't bother hiding, the one that lived just under the surface of his face whenever he thought he had the upper hand. Jess went very still beside me. Ryan suddenly found the tablecloth fascinating. I picked up my glass of water, took a slow sip, and said, "Okay." He blinked. That was not the answer he was expecting. "Okay?" he repeated. "Okay," I said again, and smiled the way you smile when you've already decided something, but haven't told anyone yet. My name is Clara Marin. I'm 32 years old. I have a degree in communications, 7 years of marketing experience, and a husband who recently made the worst strategic mistake of his career. He just didn't know it yet. I need to back up, because the dinner table moment didn't come from nowhere. It was the latest in a pattern that had been building for almost 2 years, slow enough that I kept rationalizing it, fast enough that by the time I noticed, I was already deep inside it. Derek and I met when I was 28. He was charming in the way that some men are charming effortlessly, almost carelessly, like he was doing you a favor by turning it on. He had a good job in sales, a nice apartment, and a laugh that made entire rooms tilt toward him. I fell for the laugh first. Most people did. In the beginning, he was generous. Dinners out, weekend trips, flowers for no reason. But somewhere around year 2 of marriage, the generosity started to have conditions attached to it. Little ones at first. I paid for the vacation, so you handle groceries this month. Then, bigger ones. I make more than you, so it makes sense that I manage the joint account. Then, quietly, without any single conversation where I agreed to it, my name came off the joint account entirely. I told myself it was practical. He was better with numbers. He handled the bills. I focused on my work, kept the house running, managed every social obligation we had as a couple. I planned the dinners, remembered the birthdays, bought the gifts that went out under both our names. I was the invisible infrastructure of our shared life, and he was the one who got credit for having a nice home and a put-together wife. The word wife, by the way, was the ceiling he'd built over my head. I was useful as a wife, helpful as a wife, presentable as a wife, but as a person with her own financial stake in our life together, that conversation never happened. Until he decided to have it publicly, over cooling pasta, in front of Jess and Ryan. What he didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was that 3 months before that dinner, I had started quietly rebuilding. It began after a Sunday in February when I tried to use our joint card to buy new running shoes, and it was declined. Not because there was no money, there was plenty of money. Derek had simply lowered my spending limit without telling me. When I asked him about it later, he said, "You were spending too much on things we don't need." He said we, but he meant you. He always did that. Used we when he was making a unilateral decision. I stood in that shoe store, card declined. A bored teenager at the register looking at me with mild pity, and I felt something shift behind my sternum. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more useful than anger. Clarity. That night, I opened a new savings account under my name only. I transferred what I had in my personal spending account, not a lot, but enough to start, and I set up a small automatic transfer from my paycheck every 2 weeks. Not enough for him to notice. Enough to matter. I also called Jess. Jess had been my best friend since college. She knew Derek, liked him the way you like a coworker you'd never actually choose to spend time with. She was the one person I trusted completely, and the one person I'd been most careful not to worry with the smaller indignities of my marriage. But that night in February, I told her everything. The account, the limit, the slow erosion of my financial agency that I'd been narrating to myself as practicality for 2 years. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, How long has this been going on? Longer than I admitted, I said. Okay, she said. What do you need? I told her I didn't need anything yet. I just needed someone to know. She said, I know. And I'm here, whatever you decide. That was 3 months before the dinner table. So, when Derek made his announcement from now on, your expenses are your problem, I already had a savings account he didn't know about, a financial advisor I'd had 2 consultations with, and a very specific plan for a very specific opportunity that was coming up in 6 days. I just said okay and poured the wine. Here's the thing about men who use money as control. They almost always also use you as a social asset without realizing those 2 things are in direct contradiction. Derek controlled my spending, but he also counted on me. Counted on me to charm his clients, remember his colleagues' spouses' names, send thank you notes on our behalf, and generally perform the invisible labor of making him look like a man with his life together. It never occurred to him that those 2 things couldn't coexist forever. The opportunity I mentioned was his company's annual client dinner. Every year, Derek's firm hosted a dinner for their top 10 clients, a formal event at a downtown restaurant, spouses invited, meant to feel warm and personal rather than corporate. For the past 3 years, I had been the reason it felt that way. I knew the clients' names. I knew which one had a daughter applying to colleges, which one had recently lost a parent, which one preferred to talk about his boat rather than business. Derek would walk in with me on his arm, and the room would warm up, and he would take all the credit for the atmosphere I had spent weeks quietly engineering. This year, the dinner was in 6 days. He reminded me about it on Saturday morning, sliding the invitation across the kitchen counter like a memo. Dress nice. The Harmon account is going to be there, and you know how Patricia Harmon likes you. I know, I said. The Kellermans are bringing their son this year, so maybe brush up on whatever he's into. Derek likes you. He's going to be taking over the account eventually. He called his client Derek too. He had never found this funny. I had stopped pointing it out. Sure, I said. And can you make a reservation somewhere for after? Somewhere good. The Harmons will probably want to extend the evening, and I don't want to scramble. I took the invitation off the counter, folded it once, and slid it into my bag. I'll handle it, I said. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his phone. It did not occur to him that a woman he had just told to manage her own expenses was now being asked to manage his most important professional evening of the year. The contradiction was invisible to him. That was the problem with people who took invisible labor, for granted they couldn't see it even when you held it up to the light. I called Jess that afternoon. He asked me to come to the client dinner, I told her. Of course he did, she said. I'm going, I said. But not the way he's expecting. She was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then, tell me everything. The dinner was at Sardo, a downtown restaurant I had personally selected 2 years ago when Derek asked me to find somewhere impressive. I knew the host. I had a relationship with the event coordinator. When I called on Monday and explained that I would be attending the dinner as a guest not in an organizational capacity and that I needed a small adjustment to the seating arrangement, they were accommodating. I also sent Patricia Harmon a personal note. Just a brief, warm message saying I was looking forward to seeing her and mentioning that I'd read the article she'd been quoted in last month and found it fascinating. Patricia was a senior VP who had built her division from 12 people to over 200. She appreciated being seen as more than her husband's +1. We had that in common. I booked a follow-up reservation for after dinner, but under my name, not Derek's. I picked up my dress on Wednesday. Dark green, structured. The kind of dress that said I came here on purpose. On Thursday evening, I told Derek I would meet him at the restaurant. I had a work thing that was running late, I said. He barely looked up from his laptop. Just don't be late. The Harmons arrive at 7. I know when the Harmons arrive, I said. I've been managing their table for 3 years. He looked up at that. Something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, not quite recognition. Somewhere in between. I just meant. I know what you meant, I said. And I smiled, and I went to get ready. I arrived at Sardo at 6:58. The Harmons were already there. Patricia saw me first, across the room, and her face opened into a genuine smile, the kind that isn't for appearances. She crossed to me before I even reached the table. Clara, she said, taking both my hands. I got your note. I've been looking forward to this all week. Me too, I said. I want to hear everything about the expansion. By the time Derek arrived at 7:05, slightly late, slightly flustered, tie not quite straight, I was already seated between Patricia Harmon and a young man named Eli Kellerman, who it turned out was interested in marketing analytics, and who had been leaning forward with enthusiasm for the past 4 minutes while I told him about a campaign I'd run the previous quarter. Derek stopped when he saw me. Just for a moment, a half-step pause that only I caught, and maybe Jess would have caught if she were there. Then he smiled his client dinner smile and moved toward the table. The evening went the way those evenings went, with one significant difference. Every time a client mentioned something personal to Harmon's Foundation, the Kellerman's expansion plans, a story about someone's recent trip, the reference came from a conversation they'd had with me. Not with Derek. The room's warmth had a source, and that source was sitting in a dark green dress and was no longer pretending to be a supporting character. After the main course, Patricia leaned toward me and said quietly, "I hope Derek knows what he has in you." I looked at her. "He's learning," I said. Midway through dessert, Derek leaned over and said under his breath, "You're doing great." Like I was a new hire who'd handled a call well. Like my performance tonight was something he was grading. I turned to look at him fully. "I know," I said. And then I turned back to my conversation. After dinner, when Derek moved toward the group to coordinate the after-party, I stood and addressed the table. "I've made a reservation just down the street, the Blue Room. They're holding a table for 9 at 9:30, under Marin." I said my last name. Not his. Mine. "Whenever anyone's ready." Derek looked at me from across the table. I watched him register my name, not our name. The reservation I'd made, the room I'd organized, the table I'd managed all evening, and I watched him understand, perhaps for the first time in 2 years, exactly how much I had been doing. And for whom. He didn't say anything. Not there. On the way home, in the car. He was quiet for the first 3 blocks. Then, "You did that on purpose." "Did what?" "The reservation." "Your name. You told me to handle it," I said, looking out the window. "I handled it, Clara." "Derek." He exhaled. "This is about what I said at dinner last week." "This is about a lot of things," I said. "But yes." That's where I stopped being quiet about them. He gripped the steering wheel. "You embarrassed me." I turned to look at him. "I organized your most important professional evening of the year, charmed every client at that table, and made a reservation that extended a profitable evening by 90 minutes. How? Exactly. Was that embarrassing?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. "You embarrassed yourself," I said. "When you told me in front of our friends that you weren't my ATM. Those are the words people are going to remember. Not the name on a dinner reservation." He was quiet for the rest of the drive. I had already moved most of what I needed to move. The week between his announcement and the client dinner, I had been methodical. My direct deposit now went entirely into my private account. I'd had a conversation with our building's leasing office. The lease was in both our names, but I had been the one to sign the renewal 2 years ago, and I had been the one paying rent for my income for the past year while Derek paid utilities. I documented this. My financial advisor helped me understand exactly what I was entitled to and what I needed to protect. The night after the dinner, I slept in the guest room. Not dramatically. I just moved my pillow and went to bed. In the morning, he knocked on the door at 7:15. He looked tired. He was holding 2 cups of coffee the way people do when they want to signal a truce. I sat up and looked at him in the doorway. "I'm not angry," I said. "I want you to know that. I'm not emotional about this." "Then what are you?" he asked. "Decided," I said. He set my coffee on the dresser and sat down on the edge of the chair in the corner. "I don't want to lose you over a fight about money." "It's not a fight about money," I said. "It's a conversation about whether I'm a person in this marriage or a function." He flinched. "Good. When you lowered my spending limit without telling me, I was standing in a store holding shoes I needed. Not wanted, needed. I run 5 miles every other morning. My old shoes were worn through. And I stood there, card declined, and I thought, when did I agree to this? When did I sign up to have my own access to money reviewed and reduced without a conversation?" He didn't answer. I'm not asking you to apologize right now, I said. I'm telling you what happened, and I'm telling you that the dinner on Friday wasn't revenge. It was just me stopping the performance of being smaller than I am. He looked at his coffee. I didn't know you felt that way. You didn't ask, I said. That's different from me not communicating. The silence in that room was different from the silences we'd had before. This one had edges. Things living inside it that couldn't be unheard. What do you want to do? He asked finally. I want to think, I said. And I want you to think about what kind of marriage you actually want. Because I know what kind I want, and I've been settling for a different kind for 2 years. He left for work at 8. I stayed home that morning. I had vacation days saved, and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and my coffee, and I looked at apartment listings for the first time in 4 years. Not because I had decided to leave, because I needed to know that I could. That knowledge, the knowledge that you can survive without the thing that's been slowly diminishing you, is the most important kind of freedom. I didn't know I'd been without it until I started getting it back. Jess came over that afternoon. She brought groceries, real ones, ingredients, and we cooked together in my kitchen, something I hadn't done purely for pleasure in longer than I could remember. I used to cook constantly before Derek started leaving comments about dishes I made, little offhand observations. This is a lot of effort for a Tuesday. Do we really need to dirty 4 pans? I had stopped cooking elaborate things without realizing I was doing it. That afternoon, I made a proper roast chicken with herbs I picked from the small pot on the windowsill and roasted root vegetables and a simple dessert with pears and brown butter. Jess poured wine and sat on the counter, and we talked for 3 hours. You know what I keep thinking about? I said, near the end of the evening. What? How long? I explained it away. Every time he did something that felt like a wall going up, I found a reason why it was actually practical. Or why I was overreacting. Or why picking a fight about it would cost more than letting it go. That's not a character flaw, Jess said. That's what happens when someone's careful about it. They make you feel like the alternative is being unreasonable. I thought about that. Yeah, I said, that's exactly right. She raised her glass. Well, you're being unreasonable now. Finally, I said. We clinked glasses. Derek came home at 9. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, saw Jess, saw the meal on the stove, smelled the herbs and roasted garlic. He looked around the kitchen the way you look at something when you realize you've been taking it for granted. He said, "This smells incredible. It's Jess's portion and mine." I said, "You didn't tell me you were eating at home tonight." It was accurate. He hadn't told me. For years, that hadn't mattered, because I cooked enough for 3 people every night out of habit. Out of the assumption that my job was to be prepared for whatever he needed. Tonight I had cooked for 2. Not to punish him. Because I had cooked for 2 people, and those 2 people were me and Jess. He made toast and eggs and ate them at the kitchen counter, while Jess and I finished at the table. He didn't complain. That, more than anything, told me something had shifted. 3 weeks passed. Some of them were hard. Derek and I had several real conversations, not the surface skimming kind we'd been having for years, but actual ones, with silences and wrong words and having to try again. He admitted that he had used money to feel in control, that he'd grown up watching his father do the same thing to his mother and had never examined whether he'd inherited it. That conversation cost him something. I could see it. I respected him more for having it than for anything he'd said in years. But some things can't be uncircled. I didn't move out. We didn't separate, not formally, not yet. What we did instead was harder and stranger. We tried to rebuild something on an honest foundation instead of the one we'd been living on. Some days it felt possible. Some days the distance between who we'd been and who we might become felt like more than a marriage could cross. I kept my private account. I negotiated my name onto our joint account as an equal, with equal access. I kept working with my financial advisor. I started taking on freelance projects, a few clients who needed marketing strategy, referred through former colleagues. The extra income was smaller than symbolic at first, and then it wasn't small at all. I wrote about some of it, loosely, in a piece I submitted anonymously to an online magazine I'd been reading for years. I framed it around the question of financial independence in marriage, not as a betrayal of partnership, but as a prerequisite for it. You can't truly choose to share something you're not allowed to own. The piece was published on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday it had been read 50,000 times. My inbox became unmanageable. Messages from women who recognized the shoe store moment, that precise flash of clarity in a mundane place, holding something they needed, being told by the infrastructure of their own life that they didn't have access to what was theirs. Messages from women who were 2 years in, 5 years in, 20 years in. Messages that said, "I read this and I called my sister. I read this and I opened an account. I read this and I finally said the thing I had been saving." One message was from Derek. No greeting. No apology. Just, "Did you write about us?" I replied, "I wrote about what I went through. That belongs to me." A long pause. 3 dots appearing and disappearing for almost a minute. Then, "It's good. You're a good writer." I stared at my phone for a moment. Then I typed, "I know." The article led to a second one, and then an invitation to speak on a podcast about financial dynamics in relationships. I sat in my home office. The small second bedroom I had decorated and Derek had used to store golf equipment, until I quietly relocated the clubs with my headphones on and talked for an hour about the specific, invisible ways that financial control operates in marriages. Not dramatically. Not as a survivor monologue. Just plainly, as someone who had been inside it and had mapped the architecture. The response was the same: immediate, overwhelming, personal. Patricia Harmon emailed me after the podcast. She had found it through a colleague. "I didn't know," she wrote. "You always seemed so composed." I wrote back. Composed was the symptom, not the solution. She asked if I'd ever considered consulting work. That was how I started my own client list. There is something that happens when you rebuild your sense of what you're worth without anyone else's permission. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just starts showing up in small places, in how you sit at a table, in what you do and don't apologize for, in the way you hold a dinner reservation under your own name without a second thought. I used to think that strength in a marriage meant enduring the parts that hurt in service of the whole. Now I think that's the exact way to lose both the whole and yourself. One evening in October, I came home to find Derek had cooked dinner. An actual dinner, not toast, not cereal, but something he'd clearly looked up and spent an hour on. Chicken, slightly overcooked, with rice and a salad that was dressed too early. I sat down across from him and looked at the plate. "I'm learning," he said. "I know," I said. And I meant it. We ate together, and for once the quiet between us didn't have anything waiting inside it. Just 2 people figuring out who they were to each other after agreeing to stop pretending. My second royalty check arrived the following week. It was not a small number. I transferred a portion into the new fund I had set up, a small grant program for women working toward financial independence after controlling relationships. I named it the Open Account Project. It felt like exactly the right name for something built from a closed one. That same week, I bought new running shoes. I paid for them myself, from my own account, with my own card. They fit perfectly. I laced them up on a Saturday morning, walked to the kitchen, poured coffee into my favorite mug, the tall ceramic one he had once called too much, because he found a lot of things I loved to be too much, and I stood at the window looking out at the street below. The city was already going. People with dogs, people with strollers, a man arguing cheerfully on his phone, 2 kids racing on scooters down the bike lane. All of them living their own version of whatever this is, the long, imperfect work of figuring out who you are in relation to someone else. I took a slow sip of coffee. For the first time in longer than I could name, I felt like the whole square footage of my own life. Not a wife function. Not a social asset. Not the invisible infrastructure that made someone else look warm and organized. Just Clara. And Clara, it turned out, was more than enough.